Something like 1,700 people a day are dying just in the United States alone from cancer. Why do you think cancer today is so ubiquitous?
It's predominantly the diet and lifestyle. American diet and lifestyle is killing Americans.
Cancer expert, Professor Thomas Seyfried.
But we also export that diet and lifestyle to other countries. As soon as the American diet enters your population, you have cancer, type 2 diabetes, dementia, all the different chronic diseases that we seem to find. But of course, the Aboriginal folks that have not American diet lifestyle, they rarely have cancer. Cancer is kind of unknown. The connection between dysregulated cell growth and mitochondria is very, very clear to me and many others, but not to the majority of people working at the top oncology centers. So clearly, what does diet and lifestyle mean? Well, it means eating large amounts of highly processed carbohydrate foods, minimal exercise, a lot of stress in the environment, are considered Western diet lifestyle. So that's pretty much how mitochondria become damaged. Obviously, we're not making any major progress in reducing cancer because we're focusing on things that are not essential to the real problem.
Hey there, friends. Welcome to the Happy Habit Podcast. I'm Matthew. On this podcast, I like to talk health, wellness, and self-improvement with the world's leading experts every Monday and Thursday. So if that is your thing, if you're looking for a little bit of inspiration and some education, well, this is the place for you. Now, there are so many podcasts out there. In order to help me stand out and help us to grow, well, then I need your help and support. It'll cost you absolutely nothing and will take 2 seconds. So if you're enjoying the content on this podcast, please like, subscribe, share with other people who you think might enjoy it too, and leave the podcast a positive rating, which I know you can do on iTunes and on Spotify. Many of you have already done that to date. I think we're up to about 4.8 out of 5 on Spotify, which is fantastic. Also a reminder on Spotify, if you've got Spotify Premium, you can now watch the videos of these podcast episodes. But if you don't have Spotify Premium, well then if you become a subscriber on YouTube, well then you can watch the videos of these episodes for absolutely nothing. And you can become a subscriber over there too. Now today I am joined by a world-renowned professor in the field of cancer research. His name is Professor Thomas Seyfried. He is an American professor of biology, genetics and biochemistry at Boston College. And he has been very vocal about the medical community's approach to researching and treating cancer, which he believes has taken the wrong path of focusing far too heavily on genetic mutations. We ask why cancer seems to be so ubiquitous today and what exactly is driving this disease. We hear about Professor Seyfried's contention that cancer is not a consequence of genetic mutations, but that it is in fact a mitochondrial metabolic disease. Expect to learn about a doctor called Dr. Otto Warburg, whose ideas about the origins of cancer and fermentation from 100 years ago are now being proved to be correct, according to Professor Seyfried. Discover where fermentation features in the cancer equation. Find out what happens when you deprive tumour cells of glutamine and glucose. We hear about the impact calorie-restricted diets had on children with epilepsy and what this means for cancer research, patients and recovery. And among other things, Professor Seyfried tells us of the laundry list of negative effects of existing cancer treatments, which he believes are simply not working for cancer patients today. This is a really illuminating, a fascinating discussion with a man who is passionate about cancer research. I hope you enjoy it. Well, Professor Seyfried, it's great to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for your time today. You have made it your life's work to study cancer, and it's a disease that, as we all know, has affected and touched every family and probably every viewer and listener to this podcast, unfortunately. Can we first just set out exactly what cancer is from the perspective of the out-of-control cell division, I think, which we're all aware of, but also crucially from the perspective of the dysfunctional energy production, which I think most people are unaware of?
Yeah, well, thank you, Matt. Listen, the definition of cancer is cell division out of control, dysregulated cell growth. That's the issue that we're dealing with. The question is, how does that happen? And the organelle that controls the quiescent differentiated state is the mitochondria, the energy-generating organelle within the cytoplasm of the cell. So that has not received as much attention as the nucleus, because when you look under the microscope, you can see a nucleus clearly in a cell. But you really need to look at electron microscopy to see the mitochondria. And so just because you don't see it for many decades until you really started looking at it with more high-powered electron microscopy, you kind of ignored it, not being as important as the DNA and the cell division that seems to take place with the nucleus and the mitosis and all this kind of stuff. But all that is controlled by the energy within the cell. The mitochondria control the energy. So the organelle that maintains this stable differentiated state of cells is dependent on the efficient energy production from that mitochondrion. If that mitochondrion becomes dysfunctional or inefficient in some way, the cell begins to ferment, which is an ancient form of energy, and it's associated with dysregulated cell growth. So the connection between dysregulated cell growth and mitochondria is very, very clear to me and many others, but not to the majority of people working at the top oncology centers.
Okay, we'll come back to that shortly. You gave a very interesting statistic there recently. Something like 1,700 people a day are dying just in the United States alone from cancer. Why do you think cancer today is so ubiquitous?
Well, it's almost 1,700 people a day in the United States, which comes out to about 70 an hour. People dying. And in China, it's even greater. They have about 8,100 a day dying, a bigger population, of course. It's predominantly the diet and lifestyle. American diet and lifestyle is killing Americans, but we also export that diet and lifestyle to other countries.
Exactly.
As soon as the American diet enters your population, you have cancer, type 2 diabetes, dementia, all the different chronic diseases that we seem to find. But of course, the Aboriginal folks that have not adapted diet and lifestyle, American diet and lifestyle, I mean, they rarely have cancer. Cancer is kind of unknown. They have infections and they have parasites and they have all kinds of other things, but they don't usually have type 2 diabetes or cancer. And that's been documented over and over again. So clearly, what does diet and lifestyle mean? Well, it means eating large amounts of highly processed carbohydrate foods, minimal exercise, a lot of stress in the environment, are considered Western diet lifestyle. So that's pretty much how mitochondria become damaged.
If you want to learn how to implement the ketogenic diet and the Press Pulse protocol into your cancer management, just visit school.com/keto for cancer, the new community by our research analyst Johnny Rockermeyer. Within this new community platform, you can connect with other patients and learn from their experiences. You can also just search through the posts other members have already made. You will have access to our classroom section as well, which provides practical advice and tools for the best results. These sections cover all parts of the Press Pulse protocol that you should implement. Starting with the general scientific concepts by Dr. Thomas Seyfried, we will show you how to start the ketogenic diet, including which foods to choose and which to avoid. Additionally, we prepared a list of doctors specialized in metabolic therapy, as well as details about glutamine inhibition and hyperbaric oxygen protocols. So, take a look around at school.com/keto for cancer.
Your central thesis is that cancer is not a disease of the genes.
Yes. I mean, this has been shown by the nuclear mitochondrial transfer experiments. It's clear that when you take the nucleus of a tumor cell with all the so-called mutations and you put that in the cytoplasm of a normal cell, growth regulation is restored. So, and if you take the nucleus of a normal cell and put it in the cytoplasm of a tumor cell, the cells become growth dysregulated. So clearly it's in the cytoplasm. And when you look at what is in the cytoplasm that plays a role in the differentiated state or the growth dysregulated state, it's the mitochondria. So no one denies the mutations that you see in cancer cells. The problem is they're mostly irrelevant. They're downstream epiphenomenon of the damage to oxidative phosphorylation. So yes, when you have abnormal oxidative phosphorylation, you produce reactive oxygen species, which are carcinogenic and mutagenic. So the damage you see in the nucleus, the mutations and all these things that people are trying to target and look at and doing all that, it's a big waste of time for the most part. And obviously, we're not making any major progress in reducing cancer because we're focusing on things that are not essential to the real problem. So so it's a theory. It's the theory under which you understand the disease to be. Is it a genetic disease according to the somatic mutation theory, or is it a mitochondrial metabolic disease according to the mitochondrial metabolic theory of cancer? And once you realize it's a mitochondrial metabolic problem, then you can logically restrict the fuels that are driving the dysregulated growth, and you'll start to see a huge drop in death rates and improved overall survival once people understand what the correct theory is, and that has not yet happened.
We'll come back to that. We'll also come back to the downstream effects of those reactive oxygen species that the medical world seems to be obsessed with at the moment. We'll come back to that in a second. But if I can go back to the origin of this as far as you're concerned, because I believe Sam Apple wrote a very interesting book called Ravenous about Dr. Otto Warburg, who casts a huge shadow over any conversation in relation to cancer, because he even lent his name to the Warburg effect. Can you talk to us about Dr. Otto Warburg and his significance in this discussion? Because his ideas are not new. Now, he's long since dead, but his ideas came to pass, about 100 years ago or so?
Yeah, well, of course, I had no clue, other than hearing his name, what he actually did, until we started doing our own research in the lab. Looking at the growth, this dysregulated growth of brain cancer tumors in mice, and we noticed that if you restrict the caloric intake and lower the blood sugar and elevate the ketones, ketone bodies, we were getting really, really significant reductions in the growth of the tumors, the blood vessels, the tumor cells were dying. All the things that we call the hallmarks of cancer were beginning to change. And I said, "Wow, isn't this remarkable?" And then I started looking in the literature, and I said, wow, this guy, Otto Warburg, had said this a long time ago. He said if oxidative phosphorylation, oxphos, the way the cells get most of their energy, is defective, they have to switch to a fermentation metabolism driven largely by glucose. So we were seeing, as you lowered blood sugar, we were seeing a significant drop and then and the rate of the growth of the tumors. And I said, let's do a deeper dive on this and start looking at what Warburg said. And as the more research I did, the more evidence that I collected supporting what Otto Warburg said. But then we started doing even deeper dives. And Warburg did not know that there is a second fuel that could drive the fermentation metabolism, and that's the amino acid glutamine, which is, he did not know about that. That's our big thing. We're now showing that glutamine, along with glucose, can both be fermented. That means generating energy without oxygen. So these are, and I know it might be hard for some folks to understand how cells get energy. It's either oxidative phosphorylation with oxygen, or it's substrate level phosphorylation, which is an ancient form of energy that cells would use, and that's called substrate level. It doesn't require oxygen, substrate level phosphorylation. So Warburg knew about the substrate level phosphorylation with glucose. He did not know the second big part of this whole process, which is the glutamine. And he referred to it as aerobic fermentation. And it was, why are you continuing to ferment when you have oxygen present? And the cancer cells continue to ferment even though oxygen is present. And he did not coin the term Warburg effect. That was done by Ephraim Racker at Cornell University, and now everybody became so confused about the Warburg, aerobic fermentation, because they were focusing on mutations, not looking at the underlying biochemical problem. So they seem to not understand that the cells ferment because the oxidative phosphorylation is defective. And they said, oh, but these cancer cells are sucking down oxygen just as readily as some of the normal cells. And we and others have shown that oxygen consumption in cancer cells is not linked to ATP, energy synthesis. It's linked to ROS production, reactive oxygen production, which is causing the mutations in the nucleus. Now, so this is something that people don't want to know about. They're very comfortable comfortable knowing that cancer is a genetic disease, you come along and explain the whole system to them and why they're looking at the wrong thing, and they don't like to hear it. They're locked into an ideological dogma. This is not something that people want to hear about.
Where then in the conversation does the mitochondria controlling cell cycle come in then?
Yeah, so they actually, when the cytoplasm divides, the mitochondria go into both of the daughter cells. But their regulation and they're a separate organism inside. They are one organism inside another, the cell. So they pretty much control the cell cycle. When the cell starts to synthesize DNA, undergoes mitosis, and all this is regulated by the mitochondria. So the mitochondrion control, like when a cell gets aged or sick or has to turn over and slow, the mitochondria, energy metabolism of the cell controls that. And it's a very sophisticated, it's linked to the proton motive gradient within the mitochondria. Calcium signaling controls the cyclins of the cell to allow it to either remain quiescent or divide when necessary. When that organelle becomes corrupted from a variety of insults from the environment, like hypoxia, carcinogens, radiation, or whatever, that cell loses control of the quiescent state, and the cell then falls back on the ancient pathway of fermentation, which is dysregulated growth. All cells, we all originated, or life originated from single cells before oxygen came in the atmosphere, as I said, about 2.5 billion years ago. All the cells at that time were dysregulated in their cell growth. They would grow as long as fermentable fuels were available and then die when the fuels were used up. The cancer cells are doing the same thing. They're falling back on these ancient pathways because the mitochondrion that would control this whole process has lost control because its energy efficiency using oxygen has been corrupted. So the cells fall back on an ancient fermentation pathway. And this is dysregulated cell growth, which is the default state of cells. They proliferate when they're no longer under control. Who's maintaining the control? The mitochondrion is maintaining the control. So the control system of regulating quiescent and division is kaput. It's the kill switch. It's not working, and these cells are growing out of control. And as long as they have glucose and glutamine in their microenvironment, they will continue to be very difficult to kill.
And so this cell proliferation then leads to the growth of tumors that we're all familiar with.
Yes. And as these tumors grow, whether it's a blood cancer or a solid tumor, they're throwing out lactic acid, waste products of the fermentation metabolism, which then the body views as a wound. So the body sends in immune cells that throw on further growth factors and cytokines, creating an escalating situation. These are normal program processes of the body. It's just they're done incorrectly when it comes to the tumor. Normally, if we have a cut, a scratch, or a contusion, our immune system will come in and correct the microenvironment, wound healing, we call it. And because don't forget, if we break the skin, we get all these pathological bacteria, staph and strep, and this kind of thing. We have to have an immune system to not only kill invading bacteria that will kill us, but also correct the damage to the microenvironment. But when you have a growing tumor cell, the body views it as an unhealed wound, and it keeps throwing growth factors and cytokines, which are then fueling the dysregulated growth of the tumor. So it's a normal biological process done out of context in an incorrect way, and you get this continual growth. And this can happen whether you have a leukemia in the blood, whether you have a brain tumor, colon tumor, breast tumor. They're all driven by a fermentation metabolism. So that's the commonality of all cancer. They're driven by fermentation metabolism in a dysregulated way. That makes perfect sense once you understand the concepts.
And so what you're saying then is that modern diets, which are so focused on sugar and highly processed foods, then are providing the fuel which is fueling this fermentation process.
Well, in a way, that's correct. There's a lot of things that would be driving, or at least a fuel in the microenvironment. As I said, yes, it is sugar for sure. Glucose, that is, as Warburg clearly said. So this tumor cell absolutely needs glucose, but they also need the other amino acids. Glucose does not provide nitrogen for DNA and RNA synthesis. So glucose has nice carbons for synthesis of fatty acids and nucleic acids, but they don't have the nitrogen. Sugar does not contain nitrogen, and we need nitrogen to synthesize DNA and RNA, and proteins, and that comes from the glutamine. So that's why you have these two fuels pouring into these cancer cells in an unregulated way. And now the oncogenes, which you hear a lot about, these oncogenes, they are facilitators of opening the floodgates to allow the sugar and the glutamine to come into these cells. So they facilitate that, because in order to switch from oxidative phosphorylation to substrate level phosphorylation, which is far less efficient than oxidative phosphorylation, you need a logistical supply of the fermentation fuels. So the fermentation fuels are in the microenvironment, but the transporters to get them into the cell have to be opened up. You need to open those transporters, and that's the role of the oncogenes. So the oncogenes turn on to allow the glucose and glutamine to pour into these cells to give them the energy that they need, which is very inefficient. So you need a lot of fermentation fuels, whereas the normal cell needs very little glucose and doesn't mostly use glutamine. So there's a shift in the way cells get energy when they're regulated and dysregulated.
I'm glad you mentioned, I should say, oncogenes there, because in your book, Cancer as a Metabolic Disease, you talk about the oncogenic paradox. Can you explain exactly what this is?
Well, the oncogenic paradox was coined by Albert Szent-Györgyi. He received the Nobel Prize for his work on vitamin C. And he was also struggling with the cancer issue as well. I mean, this was a big part of his life work. And the paradox is, how is it possible? And we answered the paradox. He was not able to, he raised the paradox. We answered the paradox. Okay, so he said, how is it possible that so many things in the environment could cause dysregulated cell growth through a common pathophysiological mechanism? And it wasn't clear. Like, some person may have gotten cancer from being exposed to a carcinogen. Another person may be from radiation. Another person from intermittent hypoxia. Another person from an oncogenic virus. Another person just simply because they live longer on the planet. What common pathophysiological mechanism could account for the dysregulated cell growth that would appear in a population of cells in someone's tissue, whether it's a breast, a colon, a bladder, a brain? Is there any commonality to link a variety of things in the microenvironment or out in the external environment to a common mechanism to account for dysregulated cell growth? And that common mechanism is every one of those provocative agents will impact on the function of the mitochondrion. It will chronically damage the mitochondrion's ability to produce energy. This is what Warburg said. He said, cancer cannot occur if the mitochondria remain healthy. Cancer can only occur following chronic damage to that organelle, not acute damage. Acute damage will kill the cell. You never get a cancer cell. So it's got to be a chronic damage and an opportunity for the cell to switch gradually to fermentation metabolism. So that's the origin. And there's many different ways you can get to that. And this was the oncogenic paradox. Nobody could figure out how viruses, carcinogens, intermittent hypoxia, inflammation could cause a dysregulated population. But all this is related to the damage and disruption of oxidative phosphorylation coupled to a compensatory fermentation. And that compensatory fermentation, you upregulate oncogenes, and the oncogenes allow the fermentation fuel. If the cancer cell cannot ferment, it will die because you're losing its energy. Without energy, no cell can survive. So the cancer cell simply switches from OXPHOS to substrate level phosphorylation and becomes dysregulated as long as the fermentable fuels are there to drive the dysregulated growth. So the solution to the cancer problem is depriving these cells of glucose and glutamine while transitioning the whole body over to ketone bodies because they can't be fermented. Ketone bodies and fatty acids are non-fermentable fuels. The tumor cell absolutely has to have fermentation to be growing. So it's the solution eventually to the cancer problem will be a simultaneous restriction of the two fuels driving fermentation while transitioning the body over to fuels that the tumor cells can't use, which are fatty acids and ketone bodies. Not that complicated when you think about it in these kinds of terms. Right? Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Well, if you understand it, how come all the top medical schools don't understand that?
Oh, well, we will come to that discussion in just a second. Talking about metabolic therapies, because I know this is you're passionate about. Can we go back to the calorie restricted diets in children with epilepsy, performed by Dr. B.J. Wilder? Could you talk to us a little bit about this?
Yeah, well, Wilder came up with the ketogenic diet in 1921 at the Mayo Clinic, because he recognized that, wow, these kids are seizing out of control. And of course, when they stopped eating, drank water, invariably, most of them, not all of them, the seizures went down significantly. I have the original papers that he looked at here, because I worked in the epilepsy field for decades before our goal was to figure out how ketogenic diets block epileptic seizures. We're still trying to figure that out. We haven't figured that out. But then it became clear that, when you do water-only fasting, blood sugar goes down, and these ketone bodies. We evolved as a species to starve. We only within the last 100 years had everything we could possibly eat at our fingertips. Most of the time we were struggling to get something to eat, and we were living on our fat bodies, and the fats would be metabolized in the bloodstream, go to the liver, and you make ketone bodies. So Wilder said, well, we can't fast people to death. I mean, obviously they're going to die if you don't get any food. So I said, if you eat high-fat diet, you can create an environment similar to that of water-only fasting. And that was the origin of the ketogenic diet. And kids that could maintain this low-glucose, elevated ketone diet would have better management of seizures. And then in the 1930s and 40s, they came out with certain drugs that seemed to block epileptic seizures. And then the ketogenic diet fell by the wayside only because it was unpalatable, it was difficult to manage, and all this. And then it all was resurrected all over again by Jim Abrams, the movie producer from Hollywood, whose son Charlie had intractable seizures that were not responding to any drugs. They wanted to do brain surgery and all this kind of stuff. And he found that the only group left looking at ketogenic diets was at Johns Hopkins by my late friend Freeman, Dr. John Freeman, and his group were still studying ketogenic diets. So Abrams reached out to the Johns Hopkins group and were able to show that putting Charlie, his son, on the ketogenic diet finally stopped the seizures. And then he got Meryl Streep, the famous movie actress, to do the movie First Do No Harm, which was on the ketogenic diet. And then Jim Abrams started the Charlie Foundation, which resurrected everybody's interest back in the ketogenic diets again. Like what now do we know about the molecular mechanisms by which a ketogenic diet could stop electrical seizures in the brain? But we were doing that here on our mice because we had all these mice that had really good types of human seizures. And we were mapping genes, trying to figure out what gene was inducing these seizures in the mice. But then when we put the mice on these ketogenic calorie-restricted diets, the seizures would stop, just as we saw the kids in the epilepsy clinics. So then I said, wow, this is really, how does the ketogenic diet block epileptic seizures? And it was directly linked to how low your sugar could go and how high your ketones could go. But we were running brain cancer studies at the same time. And, just because you have parallel experiments, all of a sudden we were calorie restricting the brain cancer guys, and we were seeing the same thing, the lower glucose. And then I said, Warburg, this goes right back down to Warburg. He was saying do this. So I said, well, there's a greater need to manage cancer. We already can manage epileptic seizures. I mean, we don't cure the seizures, but we can certainly manage them to make somebody's life a little bit better. But why don't we take that same concept and put it on the cancer problem? Because we could have even a bigger impact on cancer than we can on the epileptic seizures, because the mechanism of action for calorie-restricted ketogenic diets is so much more clear for the cancer. We know because of Warburg's work how metabolic therapy can damage or can kill cancer cells. So then we did a deep dive on this, and I looked at the theories driving the viewpoints. And cancer, from the National Cancer Institute and all over the world, is considered a genetic disease because you see all these mutations in the nucleus, but they're all there secondarily to the damaged oxidative phosphorylation. So it comes right back. Cancer is not a genetic disease. The genes are downstream effects. They're not the cause of the cancer. They're downstream effects. You can't get cancer if your mitochondria remain healthy. That's the bottom line. And that's why the aboriginals and primitives all that rarely had cancer, the mitochondria remained healthy. They weren't taking the American diet lifestyle.
And so in the mice then, have you done studies in mice, not just looking at the epilepsy, but also looking at their acquiring cancer? What has been the result of those studies, or have you done those studies?
Well, I mean, we transplant tumor cells into the brain of the mouse. So these cells are already dysregulated in their growth. So, and these tumors came out of the mice spontaneously. So, I mean, some I've done with chemical carcinogens in the brain. Others I've done, let the mice develop spontaneous tumors themselves. But the frequency of spontaneous tumor growth in the mouse, you have to raise thousands of mice, and there all of a sudden you find some guy stumbling around. You take look at the brain, and you do a pathological analysis, and you say, oh, this guy's got a glioblastoma. So and then we culture the cells, and then we can keep putting them back into the brain of other mice. And then you can start to manage because then we characterize what's going on with these cells, what's their characteristic. And they all have damaged oxidative phosphorylation, and they're all dependent on fermentation. So you can't grow any tumor cell outside the body without glucose and glutamine in the media. So this is the key thing. So, people say, well, if I take away glucose and glutamine, I will have nothing to study. And I said, does that ever ring a bell in your head that if you do the same thing inside the body, you might also have nothing to study? And the answer is, we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on people studying cancer cells in the dish, in the culture dish, but they can't grow without glucose and glutamine. They can't switch to any other fuel. But then they say, well, I always say to them, take away your glucose and glutamine. Oh, but then we can't study mTOR. Oh, but then we can't study protein kinase B. Oh, then we can't study this. We can't study that. And I said, what the hell? You don't have to worry about studying that if you kill the damn tumor cell. What are you worried about? She says, yeah, but now you're taking away a whole research program for studying cancer. I said, our business is to kill the damn cells. We're in the resolution business. We're not in the business. Let's study all that crap after we have a major impact on keeping people alive longer. I'm not against people studying, stuff in a cancer dish, in a culture dish. But I'm saying, why should we allow all these poor folks to die a miserable death while you guys like to putz around studying stuff in a culture dish? And you take away glucose and glutamine, you got nothing to study. If you target the patient with the cancer and you target glucose and glutamine, all of a sudden the damn tumor cells start dying. And you transition over to ketones. They can't use ketones. You can't grow cancer cells in a dish on fatty acids or ketone bodies. Cancer cells can't use them. You got to have glucose and glutamine. Otherwise, they won't grow. And those are the two primary fermentable fuels driving the dysregulated cell growth. All this stuff makes complete sense once you understand the biology of the problem.
It seems very straightforward. It seems very simple, but I know you're very passionate about the fact that it seems to be very, very difficult to convince the medical field in general of your way of thinking. We spoke earlier about the reactive oxygen species and about the medical field being obsessed with the downstream effects of the ROS. And so what is it then about this subject that seems to dissuade the medical field at large from taking your quote-unquote innovative approach to tackling cancer?
Well, there's two major firewalls, if you will. One is dogmatic ideology. When you have a concept of how something happens, and hundreds and thousands of people are locked into that view that cancer is a genetic disease. It says on the National Cancer Institute website, cancer is a genetic disease. We're awarding millions and millions of dollars in every major country for people to study mutations and genomic abnormalities in tumor cells, because the view of cancer being a genetic disease is an ideological, dogmatic view. It's a silent assumption. So, and they've ruled out Warburg for a variety of reasons. But so they're all locked into this. This is called dogma, ideological dogma. Very hard to break ideological dogma. It's like a religion. You can't convince somebody of one religion that the other religion is more relevant to their lives. You cannot convince, that. You're not going to get Catholics to embrace Judaism to embrace Islam. You're not going to get it because people are dogmatically, you're not born with this dogma. You acquire it through culture and this kind of thing. And that's the same thing in science. when you have a dogma view that cancer is a genetic disease, and your big research grants and your drug companies are making drugs based all on this concept, this is ideological dogma. The second problem is you can't convince somebody of something when their salary depends on them not being convinced. This was stated by Upton Sinclair. So you're making a lot of money on this whole cancer industry based on the view that cancer is a genetic disease. So you're making a lot of revenue generation. The hospitals generate money, the pharmaceutical companies generate money, the federal government collects money from the taxpayers to fund things on this. So this is revenue generation. So you have two factors. You have ideological dogma and you have massive revenue generation. And you come along and say, well, the dogma is wrong and I can get cancer to be managed relatively inexpensively. Well, we don't want that. That's not going to happen anytime soon.
But I think what perplexes me as well is that the current approach to cancer treatment obviously isn't working, and it leads to ailments associated with cancer survival. I spoke with a woman, a stage 4 cancer survivor last week called Maggie Jones, and she actually mentioned your name, and I said I was going to be interviewing you this week, and she was given a 6 to 8 week prognosis 6 years ago, changed her diet, adopted a ketogenic diet at the time, and is still alive 6 years later. But as a consequence of the treatment, the chemo and the radiotherapy treatment that she got at the time, she now has aphasia, which is affecting her cognitive abilities. So could you talk to me about what other things people experience as a consequence of their conventional cancer treatments?
Yeah, well, we have millions of people on the planet that have what they call cancer survivors, having survived radiation and poisonous chemicals and a variety of other surgical mutilations. I mean, yes, it's amazing how strong the human body can be. It's amazing. You can poison it, you can irradiate it, you can surgically mutilate it, and there's still survivors out there that have this thing. But, many of these toxic treatments put you at risk for all kinds of secondary consequences. If you look at they have a program starting in major oncology centers, cancer survivor medicine. So this is where you have people that have survived radiation, chemo, surgical mutilations, and now you have hormonal imbalances, bone density issues, neuropsychiatric problems, all kinds of other ailments for the fact that you survive radiation and poisoning. So now you become a patient for a whole other array of treatments to try to keep you alive. Cardiovascular diseases are elevated, neuropsychiatric problems, digestive and hormonal and bone density issues. So you now become a candidate for a whole other range of treatments because you were irradiated and poisoned or surgically mutilated. When I look at, I get 20 emails a day or more from these patients, cancer patients, and I have to sit and listen to what they have gone through in their treatments using what we call standards of care or conventional treatments with some of these immunotherapies, CAR-T or Keytruda or one of these kinds of things, all based on the somatic mutation theory. And I look at it, their hair falls out, they're bleeding, mucus. I mean, it's just like brutal. And I said, I don't even think the Spanish Inquisition could have done more damage to people than the current standard of care, what we're doing. The Spanish Inquisition was the masters of developing human torture and, tough love for the heretics. Well, now we have standard of care for the cancer patients, and these poor patients are being brutalized by all these toxic treatments. If you view it as a metabolic disease, you can manage this without all this toxicity. And not only that, we see that many cancer patients who do adapt a metabolic approach, oftentimes other ailments go away, like type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, hypertension, along with the cancer. So they emerge much healthier from the treatment than they did when they started. And they don't have the collateral problems that you see with conventional standards of care.
How difficult is it to perform clinical trials using a metabolic approach to cancer in patients other than terminal or stage 4 cancer patients? Because I know there have been some smaller trials with those?
Yeah,
patients?
well, I think this is a very important point because we're not going to be able to do the kind of clinical trials that have been done traditionally in the cancer field, where you take certain numbers of people and you give them the drug versus another group that don't get the drug, and then you do double-blind crossover. You got the drug once, now you're switching back to the other, and you cross over like this. That's the design for a singular agent looking at an outcome. With metabolic therapy, each person is a unique entity. One shoe does not fit all. So we have to look at each patient singularly with comprehensive blood work and know what we need to do. There's no mystery when you start when you switch from a zero carbohydrate diet, slowly getting your blood sugar down and your ketones up, and then you are treated with a cocktail of drugs, non-toxic drugs that specifically target glucose and glutamine. Okay, and then you have to adjust that as to how the patients survive because every person is different. So this is not your standard clinical trial. So immediately the system says, "Oh, well, we can never use metabolic therapy because you can't fulfill the requirements of the current practice of standard clinical trial." So that's one issue. You have to redesign the way clinical trials are being done when you do metabolic therapy. Number two, you have to have people that understand this. You can't just take a bunch of physicians who think cancer is a genetic disease and start having them do metabolic therapy. They have no clue. They have to be retrained. They have to think differently about their patients. They have to think differently about the strategies that they're going to be using in the clinic. So that's another thing. You need a trained staff that understand what to do and how to do it. You have to have a different experimental design. Each person is their own control. Each person is their own control. You have a diagnosis of cancer, whether it's a stage 1, 2, 3, or 4. Some people say, "Gee, I didn't know I have cancer. The doctor just told me I've got a terminal cancer. I didn't know. I had some blood. I had a lump or something. I didn't know it was going to be like this." And those are the folks. Now you have to bring their whole body into a new metabolic homeostatic state to put pressure on that cancer cell from growing. We use surgery. Surgery can be used when done strategically. You don't go in like a bull in a china shop, start hacking away at some guy's lump or colon or breast or whatever, or ripping the person's breast off or whatever. I mean, you shrink these tumors down, make them indolent. Then you go in with the surgical procedure and correct or eliminate the problem. The whole way we're doing these trials right now make no sense in light of cancer being a mitochondrial metabolic disorder. So all that has to change. The whole way we view cancer and treat cancer and understand it has to change. Otherwise, we're not going to make the progress. As I said, we can drop cancer death rates by 40 to 50% in 5 to 10 years if we know how to do this. The problem is very few people know it. The ideological dogma says it's a genetic disease, so why are we wasting our time worrying about what some guy's eating? Most oncologists will say, eat whatever you want. Never lose weight. Don't lose weight. This is nuts. This speaks to the ignorance of the system. So you got a whole field of people that don't understand the biology of the disease they're treating. Consequently, we have 1,700 people a day dying from a disease that it's not necessarily to die from.
Now, as I said earlier, you are all for the metabolic therapeutic approach. However, you don't discount the use of conventional forms of treatment like lower dosage of drugs and lower dosage exposure to radiotherapy and chemotherapy in concert with the metabolic approach.
That's right. That's right. So our friends in Turkey, Istanbul, have found that you can get a lot of bang for your buck by cutting down the concentration of the chemo. So if you get the patient into nutritional therapeutic ketosis, some of the chemos will even have more powerful effects. And this is what we've been finding with some of the repurposed drugs, off-target drugs, these glutamine targeting drugs. When they were used on people initially, they were very toxic. They were using high doses without targeting glucose, not bringing the patient into nutritional ketosis. But when you bring the patient into nutritional ketosis, the amount of drug that you now need is much, much less. So the toxic effects become much less, and the therapeutic efficacy becomes much, much greater. So clearly, and if you want to use immunotherapies Keytruda, Opdivo, even CAR T or whatever you want to do, you don't use them at the beginning, you use them as like the final. Because if these tumor cells can be shrunk down into an indolent state, there's a few of them, there's still something there, then what's ever left from a metabolic approach, all of these cells might have something in common with each other, something that you now can target and kill the rest of them off. If you try to use the same approach at the beginning of the disease, the beginning of the diagnosis, you have every kind of a different cell in there. They may not all share the same epitope for the immunotherapy. And what's more, some of these immunotherapies not only target the epitope on the cancer cell, they might blow out your liver or kidneys or one of these other things where you see the same marker on a kidney or a liver cell as you have on your tumor cell. And therefore, you're not only targeting tumor cells, you're targeting normal tissues and organs of the person's body. So you don't want any of that crazy stuff. You want to know how to do this in a strategic way. It's a process, and you make the decision as the patient goes along. Like Maggie, I mean, if the cancer is gone and you no longer have, then you don't have to do anymore. But if you have still some residual cancer cells, you then could possibly come in with a very clear radiation beam. You could come in with a very low dose of chemo. You could come in with an immunotherapy or one of these things. So it's much more logical and less likely to harm the cancer patient than what we're doing today. Today, it's the cart before the horse. These guys just don't know the biology of the disorder they're treating. I study the biology of the disorder. We understand where the weaknesses are and how we can kill these tumor cells without all this crazy toxicity.
Can we talk about what your feelings are in relation to cancer prevention?
Well, that's the key. Our ancestors rarely had cancer. The great humanitarian physician Albert Schweitzer looked at 40,000 Africans in the primitive years ago and didn't find any cancer. Eskimos had no cancer. Aboriginals had from Australia. I mean, none of these guys. Well, what was it? So prevention. What were they doing to not get cancer? They were eating they were very active folks. They had a diet and lifestyle that was appropriate to their evolution. It's only when the great American diet and lifestyle come into their life that they have all of these things. So, obesity has now replaced smoking as a major risk factor for cancer. Okay, well, if people were really, really interested in preventing cancer, you wouldn't find very many obese people. So that tells you nobody cares. Very few people really care about prevention. So it's just like, because it's hard. Listen, you have so many foods now that are really tasty, really delicious, providing very little real nutrition and a lot of highly processed carbohydrates, creating systemic inflammation, hypoxia, all these different kinds of things linked to obesity. And you get cancer. So when you start to see people getting thin again, the cancer rates will probably go down. So it tells you can prevent cancer. You can't get cancer if your mitochondria remain healthy. I mean, it would be very unusual to see someone with a healthy mitochondria getting a dysregulated population of cells growing out of control. So that can explain, why, animals in the wild, like wolves and things, rarely got cancer. Yet our domestic dogs are loaded with cancer. They're eating the same crap that we're eating, except it's formulated in a brick or a cube or some particle. And they're full of cancer as well. The dogs are obese. The dogs have cancer. Humans are obese. The humans have cancer. I mean, they're all eating crap food. I mean, it's not a mystery here.
It always happens every single time man intervenes and gets in the way of nature. These problems arise.
Yeah, but I tell you, that jelly-filled donut is certainly really good. I'm not saying we shouldn't eat. I went to the zoo, two different zoos, one here in Boston and the other one in San Diego. And I asked the veterinarians, I said, geez, those gorillas and chimps, bonobos and orangutans. I said, they're eating there. I said, why don't you go down to the donut shop and bring a box of donuts and see these animals? I said, what would happen? Oh, she said, they'd be getting the donuts on the wall. They'd be killing each other to get these donuts. And he said, well, you don't do that. He said, oh, no, that would be animal cruelty. Feeding the orangutan the food that we eat is animal cruelty. Yeah, we're 98% similar in gene profile to these guys. We're the ones with all the cancer, these guys. But you don't tell me they wouldn't like it. Are you kidding me? I'd be pounding down those big sandwiches like there's no tomorrow. These people, you ever see a chimpanzee when he gets a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? The guy there banging the tables, he's going nuts.
It's the same as giving children. It's the same as giving children ice cream or something. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, but it's okay as a treat. It's okay occasionally. This is our great advance in society. I mean, these things are very, very enjoyable. You don't take that away. The reason why our ancestors didn't have it wasn't developed. They didn't have it. They lived for hand to mouth. They were struggling every day. There wasn't a delicatessen on every corner during the Paleolithic period. So our technology, we cultivated grains. Society, civilization built around grains, rice and wheat and corn. We built civilization around a stable food source. So we didn't have to hunt and kill animals and, gather stuff all the time. So there's a value to having food sources that are healthy and nutritious and in a level that keeps us living longer and healthier. But there's also a downside to that. When we transport foods around the world in sealed containers where the freshness and the nutrition sometimes for long shelf longevity, we're sacrificing nutrition and value of the food for shelf life longevity, and this kind of thing. So we lose a lot of the powerful nutrition of the ancestral foods that we ate in our science and technology advances. So it's, again, I think as people are aware of this, everything should be done in moderation. But humans are not moderate people. They're extremists in so many different ways. They just start eating this stuff and, man, I can't stop. It's just so tasty. But I think if you have the knowledge of what's driving the tumor, if you can prevent it by exercise, extremely important. We're trapped in long traffic jams. In almost all major cities, we're sitting in traffic. We have stress. We have poor food. We have minimal exercise, and we get cancer, diabetes, type 2 or diabetes. We get strokes. We get heart disease. We get macular degeneration, and we probably get a lot of dementia as the result of this. But these are the prices we have to pay for living in modern society. But you can try to avoid some of these things for sure.
What hope would you have for the future as far as the adoption of this metabolic therapeutic approach to cancer is concerned?
Well, I think people should be given the choice. Don't forget, metabolic therapy is no piece of cake either. It's not. The burden of success rides on the shoulder of the patient. Okay, so the patient is largely responsible for the outcome of the treatment. If the patient is non-compliant, and believe me, if our brains are addicted to glucose, and you're telling the patient, you can't eat, you have to go back to zero carb, you have to go to water fasting, you have to do this kind of stuff. A lot of people don't want to do that. I'll take the chemo and radiation and roll the dice, and maybe I'll be one of the survivors. But we're not depriving. I think everything should be there for the patient, whatever they want. If they don't have the personal discipline and they don't really care about this stuff, then they should have radiation and chemo. There should be no reason why we should deny anyone to be of poisonous radiation in their body. I mean, if they want it, that should be there for them. But then there's other folks that might say, I want to take charge of I want to battle my cancer. I don't want the system to be treating it. I want to know that if I die from the tumor, it was largely because of my inadequacies in fighting this, or I did everything I could in my way, did everything that the strategy should say. And if I don't survive, at least I know I'm dying from the tumor, rather than 50% of the people being killed by the treatment they're getting to manage the tumor. Don't forget, there's about 50% of the cancer patients are dying from some aspect of the treatment rather than from the tumor. So, but all that has to be brought out and discussed with the patient and their physicians.
You've been a loud, vocal voice in this area for a long time. Are there any other people out there who are going to carry your torch into the future as far as this is concerned?
Well, I think so, if they want to live. I mean,
no, but I mean in the medical field or in the science world, I mean.
Well, it takes time. In all major paradigm shifts in the history of science, it doesn't flip over real quick. I mean, it took centuries for the Catholic Church to accept the fact that the Earth was no longer the center of the solar system, right? The germ theory of Louis Pasteur, he was brutalized by the MDs at that time. They said because he had a Ph.D., he was unqualified to understand a disease. Well, he proved those guys all wrong. And Darwin's theory of evolution, which you can't understand cancer unless you have a comprehensive understanding of evolutionary biology. And that theory is still being kicked around. So it takes time for societies and people to come to recognize these things. And it's a gradual change. Right now, we're locked into the dogmatic ideology that cancer is a genetic disease. Well, more and more folks are coming out with papers completely showing that cannot be. It cannot be a genetic disease. It doesn't mean that the genes play no role. It just means that they're not the prime problem. The prime problem is energy metabolism. So it takes time for the systems, the fields, and then you have the people who want the change, and the system says, no, that's not the way we want to go. So you have these big institutional, societal situations. But eventually we're going to be proven right because we have the science to support what I'm saying. This is not like some abstract. I mean, this is the science. The hard science says what I'm saying is correct.
Well, talking of the science, if people want to find out more about that science and want to find out more about you, where can they go?
Well, I wrote the book Cancer is a Metabolic Disease, which is selling more now today than it was when I first published the book. So obviously somebody's hearing something. Also, we publish our papers in open access. So anybody can put my name into Google and say, what is this guy publishing? Is he just blowing out his ass, or does he actually know what he's talking about? Well, why don't you go read the damn papers? Because people are always, what food can I eat? Blah, 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 da, 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 and all this kind of stuff. So I said, read the papers. We developed the glucose ketone index calculator, which is a blood marker to allow people to know in their nutritional ketosis. So that tells you right there, I have a tool. If I'm in nutritional ketosis, it's hard to get cancer. Okay. And then they'll say, well, I did all of this and I can't get into nutritional. I said, well, work harder. Not that easy. Exercise more, eat less. But it's not that easy. But at least they have a quantitative marker so they know where they are and where they need to go. It's not like some mystery. So you have a real marker. And we publish that open access so people can look at these things. And then there's more and more health people coming along. Repurposed drugs are now making an introduction into the cancer field, working with nutritional ketosis. So it's a process. It takes time for the public and the establishment to really comprehend what all of this is. I mean, I know the path. The problem is it's everyone else that needs to know this.
It's a fascinating subject. I love your approach and I love your philosophy, and I'm all for that metabolic approach. I've spoken to quite a few doctors in this area and scientists in this area, and it also gives people agency and control over their own health and not just relying on drugs exclusively and traditional conventional treatments of chemotherapy and radiotherapy, which you've said already are so invasive and so toxic to the body.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think some people would like to know that they have some control over their soul, over their destiny. And there's a lot of power for that, power to the people, as long as they know what to do and how to do it and are given appropriate instructions by knowledgeable people. So again, it's a package. It has to be developed.
Well, a lot of knowledge dispensed in this interview today. I'll pop a link to your book and your website in the show notes for this episode. But Professor Thomas Seyfried, thank you so much. Really, really value your time today.
Oh, thank you very much, Matthew. It's very nice to be here.